Passwords are so 1990s, and I'm sick and tired of the millions of times I've had to use my phone to log into pretty much everything. Logging into my emails needs an SMS, logging into my Bitcoin needs an SMS, logging into my bank needs an SMS, and even writing the script for this video Notion required an SMS login. Honestly, there has to be a better way to authenticate, because if I have to check and write in one more SMS authentication code, I might seriously lose it. So I decided to go on the hunt, on Google obviously, to see what other options there are out there to improve authentication. There are lots of things like Google Authenticator, which uses a special QR code with timeouts, but these don't really solve the problem of having to keep my phone at hand. Beyond regular SMS authentication, there were other options too. Things like maybe geolocation checking, or using your IP address for identification, but all of these weren't that great. I did some more research and found that even Microsoft mentions that we should be looking for better options for authenticating, besides the regular SMS and email verification we currently do. And so I'm here. After almost giving up and throwing in the towel, I finally come across a provider called TypingDNA. They took an entirely different approach to the authentication game. Not only is it one without having to check SMSs every day, but it's one that could replace the whole authentication model in the future. I reached out to them because I wanted to find out more, and they were kind enough to give me an early preview of what they're working on and sponsor this video. So let me explain what makes them so special in a single sentence. They authenticate you based on how you type. That's it. This means that the next time I go to log in, instead of having to send out additional SMSs to check who I am, I simply continue to type, and the Verify system will do this automatically, using some sort of magic or machine learning or sophisticated pattern software, which really doesn't matter to me as long as it works. Why on earth does this matter, you might think? Well, let me explain the reasons. First, UX. As I mentioned, I personally am sick of SMS checks on logins, and this process effectively means you never have to leave the keyboard. It's set up unlike any other solution out there, including QR authentication apps. Secondly, from a business point of view, not having to send out SMSs saves you money. Who wants to spend God knows how much money sending thousands of SMSs to hundreds of people every single day they log in? Okay, enough talking. Let's find out exactly why I find this system so interesting by having a look at the code. Let's start off by visiting the TypingDNA website. I'm just going to type it into Google here and we'll select the very first link. We're introduced to the website, which gives us a little bit of information about their new system called Verify. TypingDNA Verify is the system that replaces SMS verification and 2FA codes, and it works by simply capturing a couple of keywords that you type in and verifying you based on the analysis of how you type. Here's a quick preview of exactly how it's working. I'm going to select email address here and just put my own, which is hello@adrianhuarog.com. We'll start the demo and immediately it pops up with a little bit of an iframe here where we can verify with TypingDNA. This iframe gets us to type in a few characters here. So in this case, I'm going to type in snowflake, anything, squirrel, and shampoo. Now I've spelled squirrel wrong, so I'm going to do that one more time. Squirrel, and click verify. It's checking how I've typed that in, and even though I've spelled something incorrectly and I've gone to fix it, it's already identified me being correct. If someone else was to type this in, they would have a different way to type it in. It's like a fingerprint, essentially. Now, while the demo seemed really simple, especially from a user, that's on purpose because we actually are doing a few different things in the back end here to make this all work. So I've done this nice flow diagram so you guys can see what we're going to be jumping into when we actually do the code and how the whole system works, because having this understanding will make it a lot easier once we actually jump into that code. Now, in terms of the front end, let's actually cover what we've done so far. We've had a user perform a login request, and that's where they maybe put in an email, a password, or even maybe a phone number. The next step here was to generate the verify button. This button is where we had that pop-up window take us to TypingDNA's Verify system. Once we completed that pop-up, there was a hidden form in the front end which submitted the request and logged the user in. Pretty simple. But there are a few things happening here behind the scenes, such as what's happening with the backend, the TypingDNA system, and the 2FA provider. So when we perform a login request, we actually start to communicate with our own backend. Here, we're connecting the TypingDNA client, and in this case, we'll be using NodeJs to do this with an application ID, a client ID, and a secret. Once we've got those connected, we can generate a payload by calling the function getDataAttribute. Here we're passing in the username or the phone number to validate which user it is, and this generates a payload that we use to generate a unique button here to verify the user. This is now going back to the front end, and once the user selects this button, it takes them directly to the TypingDNA Verify system. This is that pop-up window where we were typing out a few words and to performing a verify. Once we've performed a verify, the TypingDNA system checks whether this is the very first time a user has done so, or if they're an existing user. If it's the very first time a user is doing this, they need to connect to a 2FA provider. This is something like SendGrid or Twilio, and they'll either send out an SMS authentication or an email address to make sure that the user is a person that we're going to add into the database and that they are valid. But if, for example, we already have the user in the database, we just need to perform the verification, and this sends us the OTP code back, which is presented to a hidden form in the front end. This hidden form now validates the user. They are valid from TypingDNA's perspective, but we haven't validated them from our own backend yet. So this is the next step here we do. We actually send that OTP code back to our own front end. Our own front end then checks the email or the phone and that OTP code against TypingDNA system to make sure that the user is who they say they are. And this is the final step where we can now verify that the user is in fact the correct user and they can now log in. Okay, great. We have an understanding of how it works. So let's actually set it up. I'm going to log into the dashboard. I already have an account, but you can sign up and it's pretty simple. Once you've logged in, you're taken to the dashboard, and here you get all the details about your Verify system, like the client ID and the secret, and maybe also the integrations, which we'll look at. But before we set up any of that, we need to connect our gateways. We've got an SMS and an email gateway, and that's Twilio and SendGrid. To connect those up, you can simply select them and paste in your keys. Now in this case, you will need an account for both, and they're pretty simple to sign up. You can sign up at their respective websites and get started with them. With SendGrid, you want to sign up for an account here. I already have one, so I'm just going to sign in. Once you've logged in, you'll need to complete a couple of verification steps for you to be able to create a sender email address, as well as authenticate the domain you'll be sending from. There are a few more steps that you'll need to do to confirm your account and remove your limits. And once this is complete, we'll head to settings and API keys, and we'll generate a brand new API key with full access alongside with the email address that we've registered, and we're going to pass in those keys straight to the Verify system. Once this is done, you'll get a green confirmation that this gateway has been set up successfully. Setting up Twilio is a little bit easier, with that SMS gateway already having a connect button that lets you automatically create an account and connect it to TypingDNA Verify. Now that both of these have been set up, we can create our first integration to Verify. Simply head to Integrations here and select Manage. Or we can create a brand new one. I already have one here, so that's why I'm selecting Manage, but you can create a new integration, giving it a name and a domain, which we'll be testing it out on. Currently, I've got mine here, which is Verify with this custom ID for the domain name. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the client ID and secret to the NodeJs setup we'll be doing shortly. So make sure that you do this. The reason that mine is currently set up with ngrok.io is because it's a great place to actually just host custom domain names which get generated every single time that you launch the application. So if you don't have your own custom domain name, this is a quick and easy place to get that. Let's jump on there now to get this application before we start jumping into our code. Here's the website. It's completely free to sign up, and once you do, you will get these custom domain names that you can use, as well as an SSL certificate. But of course, if you want to use your own domain name, you can do that too without using any third-party services. To sign in, you just sign in here at the very top. Since I've already got an account, once I sign in, you simply download the application depending on what operating system you're on, and you authenticate it with the auth token. Once you've authenticated it, you can simply have it listen to a specific port and it'll automatically forward traffic from your own local host to that domain name. Alright, now let's jump into the documentation. At any point in this video, if you need more information, I'll link this in the comments below, and it basically describes everything on the TypingDNA side, as well as how to connect to different providers, summaries of the front end and the back end, as well as examples in things like NodeJs. To start off with, we're going to install the library here for TypingDNA, the Verify client that we're going to use in the backend. So let's open up a brand new instance here of VS Code. This is completely empty, and the first thing we're going to do is an npm init, and this will start off our project here. I'm going to call this Verify for our project name with version 1 and hitting enter on pretty much everything else. This creates a package.json, so we should see that just over here, and right now it's empty. I'm going to paste in the npm install TypingDNA-verify-client and hit save so it populates it into the package.json. The only other thing that we really need is an Express server. So I'm also going to install that here, Express, and probably body parser, because normally if we're pulling in data, then we use that to essentially parse it. With those two things set up now, we can create our very first file, and that'll be just index.js, where we'll have the server. If we wanted, we could jump into the GitHub repository to have a look at this library exactly as it is. There is an example here of a Node.js setup. So for example, we could copy in some of this example code to get ourselves started with the example. So in this case, I'm going to copy in this import of the TypingDNA Verify client and pass it in here. The next thing we'll need to do is populate these three items here, which is the application ID, the client ID, and the secret. We can grab that directly from the website, so let's do that now. Here on the website, we do have our client ID, so I'm just going to copy that across to our to our client ID. Next, we want to grab the secret, so let's head back to the website here, copy the client secret, and paste that into our code over here. And finally, we need the application ID. And this is generated when you create an application. I've created one over here, which is called Verify. I'm going to copy this key directly into the code under application ID. That covers our three main items that we need to initialize this project. Next, let's import our Express server, which will run the web server for us to be able to pass data to and from the client on the front end. To do this, we'll import Express by passing in const express equals require express. Then we'll also get the body parser, which we'll be using to parse post data from forms on the front end. We'll actually create the initializer here for the app by calling const app equals express. And finally, we'll pass in app.use and pass in bodyparser.url encoded with extended to false, which will essentially initialize the body parser into our Express server. Express needs to run on a certain port and to start listening. So what we'll do is set a port here as a variable of 80, and we'll also run app.listen and pass the port in with a function to execute after it is starting to listen. And in this example, I'm just going to say example app is listening on HTTP, localhost, and the port that we've provided. Let's give this a quick test. What I'm going to do is pass in node index.js and hit enter. When we do, we can see that the text here says example app is listening on port 80. And if we select that link, nothing will happen because we haven't actually created any gets or posts or anything like that. So let's do that now. What we'll do is pass in a command called app.get and pass in the /. This will mean that anytime a GET request is sent to the server, it's going to have a response, but we need to put that in. Here I'll pass in res, which is short for response, and send in some text. This is where we can put our HTML. I'm thinking let's actually get some predefined HTML to get ourselves started with this example. So I'm going to head over to Google here and put in Bootstrap 5. We'll head over to the Bootstrap 5 page and head over to examples here. And maybe we'll just use this login or sign in form as an example. We can grab the source code of all of this and head back to our example here and paste it all in. This is more or less ready to go. The only change that we need to make from this page here is to actually pass in the proper syntax, because some of these paths aren't absolute, they're relative. So I'll head over here And anytime we've got this syntax here, I'm just going to pass that in, and we should be good now to test out the page. So let's pass in the command here to launch our web server, and here it is running now on localhost. So let's now put in some of the TypingDNA Verify code to try and get this form working. If we head to the documentation, the first thing we need to do is copy over the script and put this into the header or the head of our HTML. So let's jump back in here and maybe pass this in under the link. Make sure there are no additional spaces or anything so that the script tag is properly defined, and this should import the TypingDNA Verify client for us to be able to use later in the content. The other thing we want to do is customize the form. In this case, I'm not going to be using a password, but it is probably something that you might use for your own to verify a user, at least on your own backend. But in my case, I'm just going to be checking the email address. The only other thing I'm going to do here is pass in an action for the form, and this will be a different URL for us to use. So I'm going to pass in the URL here, verify, with the method this time being a post. This will essentially create a new route that we'll need to create in terms of Express for us to be able to pass in that email address. So I'm going to pass in app post. We'll pass in verify here, and we'll just do a similar syntax to what we had earlier. With this syntax, I'm going to be calling the client here and passing in our post data. So I usually like to make sure our post data is coming in by passing in rec.body, and then also passing in the client that we'll be using here to grab that data. Now, in this case, if we go to GitHub, this is the command we'll be running here, the TypingDNA get data attribute command, and this will create the payload we'll be using to place into a verify button. So let's go back into our code and paste this in here. For the flow here, I'm going to keep this undefined because it'll default to standard. And for the language, I'm also going to leave it undefined because it'll default to English. I'm not going to be using the phone number, so I'll take that out. And for the email address here, I'm going to pass in rec.body and pass in .email here at the end so that it's referencing the proper email. Then let's head up here to our example of app-get. Finally, I'm going to add in a response. So actually, let's copy over this syntax that we had earlier. But in this case, I'm going to get rid of most of it and only leave the form section here, I suppose. And I'm going to pass in, please verify your account by selecting the button below. This is where we jump back into our documentation here on the front end, and we're going to copy over this button right over here. We're going to paste this into our code, and we're going to just fix up the syntax for any spaces that might be missing or any quotations. And here we'll see that there are a couple of attributes which need to be defined. This is the TypingDNA client ID, the TypingDNA application ID, and the TypingDNA payload, all of which we should be getting back here from our TypingDNA data attribute. So let's give this a console.log as well, and this should be clearly defined and accessible. So the other thing we can do is use some syntax here to simply pass it in. I'm just going to pass it in exactly like this. And finally, we have a callback function, which we'll define a little bit later, but this at least gets us started. The only other thing is just make sure that your class name here is TypingDNA with a capital DNA dash verify, because this is the class that will be checked against whether the window pops up. I'm going to hit save on that, and we're going to run our Node.js server once more, access it, and pass in my email address to give it a test. There we go. So we've got our pop-up window here, and unfortunately there's a few other things that we need to do here before we get started, because right now it says close and start. This is now where we need to access our web domain to be able to launch the client properly, because when you're running on localhost, it's not particularly secure, and we're not going to continue on from this step running in a local environment. We have to start accessing it from a custom domain name. Since we downloaded the application that runs a web server in the background and creates this, let's actually run this in our project. So that is just the Ngrok application file. We're going to pass in HTTP and 80 because that's the server address that we want to establish to pass into our custom domain. As soon as we do, we can see that the details here are done, and what we can do now is create a split view terminal. and pass in our web server to run on the right hand side. So here I'm going to pass in NodeJs to run on localhost, and that should pass into this online domain that we've got. So I'm going to just test this domain right now, and we should see that our sign up form is there, which is great. The only other item that we need to do here now is copy this custom domain and jump into the Verify settings here for our integration. We're going to manage this integration, and we're going to pass in the new subdomain that we're using for this so that it can work on HTTPS. Now that we've done this and we've applied it, okay, let's try this out with a random email address and select sign in. We're going to select the Verify with TypingDNA button, and when we do, we immediately now get the verification process, which we need to type in here as a test. But I'm going to leave this because there is one more step we need to do before we get to the next part to actually confirm a login, and that's in the backend here. We're going to need to create a function that actually runs once we confirm the OTP code. So if we scroll down here, we've got this callback function, and I'm going to define that right over here inside of scripts. So let's define a function called callback function to keep it simple right now, and this will give us some data. Ideally, what this data is the OTP code. So what I'm going to do is pass in a console.log so we can view what this data is. And then I'm going to also submit this data to the backend once it's received. So let's actually create a form here where we pass in document.getElement by ID. And I'm going to create this submission form soon. But for the time being, I'm just going to create this form as script. What we're going to do is if this form does exist, and this data does exist, and the data has come back successfully, then we're going to submit the form with the OTP value, and that value will be the data.otp value itself. Of course, if there's no data in there, we'll just leave it empty. Finally, for the form, we'll also submit it. So let's pass in form.submit. Beautiful. The only other thing to do here is that if there is no data, what we might do is just pass in window.location, and we'll pass in failed here, as maybe the login attempt just didn't work out. We can pass in more information as we get it back from console.log, but I want to keep this example as simple as possible. So with this done, let's actually create this invisible form. So I'm going to create a form in here. We'll do the method here as post once again, and the action here as, I suppose, attempt, or maybe OTP. OTP might be a good URL to use. We'll do an input here, and for this input type, I might make it the type of hidden, because we don't really need the user to see this. But we will pass in the name here as OTP, and the value to start off with as empty. With this form done and with this function done, we should have this function submitting to this URL called OTP or this URL called failed. So let's actually create these two URLs by copying them out, one here and one here. And I'm gonna do OTP being the second, and the first will be failed. I'm gonna remove most of the script here for the function and the form and the button. And I'm just gonna say, unfortunately, this request. And then for the second example here, for OTP, we're going to replace the main section here with you are logged in, and then log off. Beautiful. I'm gonna get rid of this check for the data attribute elements because we're not gonna be using them. But we will be creating an OTP check for the OTP section. So for that OTP check, let's actually jump into the Verify code here, and we're going to have a look at the command that we need to use for doing that OTP check. Actually, that's in Github. So that's just over here. I'm going to go back into the code on the OTP section, and here for the email, I'm going to pass in we're going to pass in rec body email. And in here, I'm going to pass in rec body OTP. We're not using a phone number, so I'll get rid of that for the time being. And that should be enough to get our response here. This response, if valid, will pass us to, so let's do response success. If the response success has failed, let's do a res location, res header, and let's pass in to failed. Otherwise, it will return false and exit this section here. Otherwise, it'll go to the send and it'll pass in that login has been completed. So this looks good. The only other thing we're missing here is a reg body email, which currently isn't in our verify hidden form. So we can pass that in similar to how we've done it previously by passing it in as an attribute here in the value. We'll do reg body email. That should be it. We should be able to use this now to test out the whole verification process. So let's restart our web server. And our web server does have a quick error there. What's that error? Let's have a look. Await is only a sync function. So there is an await function happening here. And this is on the OTP code. We've got await client validate OTP. So I'm just going to add in a sync here as part of this function and restart our web server. And that should now be listening on port 80. We're going to select verify with TypingDNA and select the input here and actually fill it out. So rainbow, copper, board, football, skating. And let's verify that. That's currently verifying and it's come up and I believe that's complete, but there is a problem here with the and sign. So let's have a look what I've done wrong here. If we have a quick look at the code, I think I've added an extra and sign here. Let's get rid of that. Restart our web server and just try that one more time. I'm going to refresh this page. Select verify. Let's put in the code over here. Cupboard, football, and skating. Select verify. And we have failed. Let's have a look why we failed. That's because we still haven't put in the ID here for the form. That's one thing I did forget. So let's actually put this ID in here, and this will populate this input once we're ready. So we'll restart our server one more time, and we'll go back here to our web server, and we'll pass in the email address. Here we'll log in and we'll verify our account. And once we've verified, we are good to go. We are logged in. So this has worked. The one thing that I did notice though, as part of the sign in process, is that our address here for failed didn't work. And that's because I've done this as a post. And this needs to be a get. So I'm just going to save that and restart our server. And that should be pretty much it. This is the whole sign-in process as it is in terms of validating. There's a few things that are happening here, but I'm going to post up all this code on GitHub so you guys can have a look at it. If we head back to our TypingDNA client dashboard, we can head over to logs and we can see more or less the interactions that are happening each time we access the server. And here we can see that we did a few typing verifications and they failed. But we did get to a stage where we started sending the OTP code, but we didn't actually double check that. And finally, with our test here, we did a verification with the email access, with the email address that succeeded and the OTP was validated and it gives us a green status. So all this logging we can view at any time, it's automatic and it's pretty cool as well so that you can see if someone is trying to brute force your system and the security is in place. So today we learned that sometimes you don't need to do SMS verification. There are other ways to do it. TypingDNA's Verify program is pretty cool in the fact that you don't have to check your phone. You can just type in a few words and it does the same process that you might do where you, for example, send an email with a number or check your phone for a number. I think this is way better personally, and it's a little bit of a different approach. If you guys think that this is pretty interesting, I might do some more videos on it, on how to integrate it with different systems and how it can be worked into, for example, logins or signups or just systems as a whole. But hopefully this gives you an idea of some of the technology happening in the background that is kind of interesting. What I'm going to do is add all the links in the description below behind the, say, test project, as well as TypingDNA's Verify program, as well as some of these articles I found out online, which talk about the security and importance of security as well, in terms of this whole process. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.